Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we're reading Swamp Thing number 164, and just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last issue, we saw the return of the three mysterious men, Don Roberto, the Traveler, and El Senor Blake, and they are now back in the picture trying to guide Swamp Thing again, at least directly now instead of in the shadows. And what they want him to do is complete the trial of the Parliament of Vapors, but Swamp Thing doesn't want to because he thinks that as he completes each of these elemental trials and becomes the next elemental of those parliaments, he is getting less and less human. And this was said to him by Abby Arcane, who is his ex-lover and wife, and it was also told to him by some trees that used to be Cajun people that Swamp Thing killed when he did his rampage at the beginning of this run. And instead of dying, they all turned into trees, and their roots have tapped into the green, and they told Swamp Thing that his humanity is in fact leaving. And the more he goes down this path of these trials, he will become less and less human until basically he's going to eradicate everything on Earth because humans will not matter to him. And we left off the last issue with Swamp Thing talking to the Traveler, and he basically told the Traveler he doesn't want to not be human, so he is not going to participate in the Parliament of Vapors trials. So first things first, with issue 164, we got the cover. It is in the same black and white style as the covers of the last couple issues. And we see what I assume is the Nightmaster because he's got a flaming sword and a cape, and he is rushing Swamp Thing, who looks to be attacking him. And around both of them, it looks like the city is definitely damaged. There are pieces of concrete and stuff on the ground, and we see people possibly trapped in a car. And we also see on this page that it is written by Mark Miller with art by Phil Hester and Kim DeMolder. And as we turn to the first page, we see we are in a police precinct, specifically in an interrogation room, and the narration says, 18th Precinct, Manhattan. And we see a police officer reading from a notepad, and he's saying, "Okay, now let me just read back this statement and make sure I got all my facts straight before we take things any further. Feel free to interrupt any time I make a mistake." And then he begins to read. 2200 hours. Police Officer Easton and Malice see you breaking into a Korean hardware store on the Upper East Side and unsuccessfully attempt to make an arrest. You threaten the officers with a 12-inch bread knife and take off down an alley, beginning a 4-mile chase which ends in a parking lot closed off by our 4 squad cars. 2213. The officers attempt to restrain you using minimum force until you become so violent and physically abusive, you leave them no choice other than to disable you with the electric stun gun. 2219. You regain consciousness. All the way here, you're yelling how you've got to defend yourself. You're telling my officers you must find some place to hide. What's going on, asshole? How come you're trying to hole up in a Korean hardware store just like Conan the goddamn Barbarian? Then we see the man he's questioning, and he doesn't look familiar, but he does answer back to the police officer saying, "I already told you. The warlocks chased us to this realm. We couldn't hold them back from you people any longer." So obviously this guy is from Mira because he knows about the warlocks, but of course he sounds like a crazy person just talking about all that. So the detective leaves the room, and as he comes out, he says to the guy at the desk, who probably was the arresting officer, "Hey, did you see the name this guy filed? Stalker the Soulless. Jesus, where do they find these jerk-offs?" And a younger officer next to him says, "I hear they're showing up all over town, Captain. What do you think, some kind of cult?" And the captain responds, "Nah, they're harmless. Probably just one of those role-playing conventions we busted last year. Kids get high, put on a pair of Spock ears, and figure they're on a quest for the Holy Grail. Sad little bastards." Then another policeman chimes in saying, "The weird thing is, everyone we hauled in so far has the same story. They say they came from some magical world called Mira and made it to Earth through a hole in reality." And the captain asks, "So what's this hole supposed to look like?" And the man who was speaking before replies, "They say it's a bookshop called Oblivion Inc. The warlocks are using it to reach us, and these freaks reckon their crazy world's going to be sucked into ours in the process." And then the captain looks at all three of them and then walks away and says, "What did I tell you? Drugs, right?" Then we cut to an outdoor shot of New York where we can see the Twin Towers, And the narration says, "And so the hemorrhage begins. The madness seeps through from Mira to Manhattan, and the night flares up like the 4th of July. Then we get a couple panels of the mayhem that's going on. And in the first one, we see what looks like demons or winged beasts flying just above the city blocks where people can see them from their windows. And it looks like the people begin to freak out as the beasts start to swoop down and grab people. In the second panel, we see 4 demons grab a woman and wrap a rope around her neck and tie her hands, and they begin to pull her away. In the third panel, we see what looks like a man withdrawing cash from an ATM, but the money looks a little strange. It doesn't quite look like American dollar bills. And in the fourth panel, we see what looks like a police officer shooting and killing what looks like a unicorn. And over these panels, the narration says, "The harpies are the first to arrive, screeching down between the city blocks to steal fruit and chubby children sweet enough for supper. Some gawky girls try to scream for help as a mob of ugly trolls trap them, giggling like schoolboys, whispering what they're going to do to them in the quiet of the shadows. 2 blocks away, a cash machine dispenses tokens only to be used in Goblin Market, along with the explicit warning to keep them out of the sunlight. A maverick cop brings down a unicorn in a crowded shopping mall, 2 shots through the body and 1 through its beautiful skull." And as we turn the page, we see a bunch of more examples of Mira bleeding into Manhattan. So I'm not going to describe each panel because I think a lot of the writing actually does it itself. So the narration on this page starts, "Offended by an aircraft's unwillingness to copulate in flight, a dragon engulfs the jumbo jet in flames, watching it melt as it plummets to the earth like a shooting star. All over the city, infants are stolen and replaced by shapeless things with adult eyes and horrible, wicked smiles. Across the street, a down-and-out takes a sip of cheap bourbon from the Holy Grail, and for the first time in his life, he understands. He understands everything. Half a mile away, everyone using the Brooklyn Bridge hits the brakes and abandons their cars, unable to answer the toll keeper's riddle, unwilling to face the risks involved." I will say this panel is kind of cool because the toll keeper that they're referring to in this is a giant troll that has a huge club, and it is probably twice as tall as the bridge. And so basically, if they fail to answer the riddle, he will just smash them and everybody on the bridge. And the narration continues. "The only sign of happiness is a nearby AIDS clinic where 2 sylphs perform an aerial dance with such grace and beauty, the patients can only sit up in their beds and applaud with delight." And in the last panel of this page, we see the guy who was being questioned by the cops earlier is in a cell with 2 other men, and as they look out the bars, the narration says, "While Stalker the Soulless and his companions, locked up in a cell beneath the 18th precinct, know the worst is yet to come." Then we turn the page and we cut to the swamp, and we see the rock construct Swamp Thing is walking back towards our Swamp Thing, who is sitting on the ground kind of sulking. And the rock construct says to him, "Can I interest you in a game of chess, Earl King? The intellectual exercise might do something to raise your spirits. I fashioned the pieces from minerals around the swamp, using the limited abilities you granted me. Perhaps you'd like to examine my craftsmanship." And as he's walking, we can see what he's talking about are not small, tiny chess pieces like for a regular board. They're actually gigantic, huge kind of monoliths of chess pieces. Like they kind of look as big as those heads on Easter Island, and just as ornately carved as well. But Swamp Thing doesn't even turn his head to look at them. He just stares at the ground and says, "Not really. I only created you for someone to talk to when I needed company. Go away and leave me alone." And the rock construct replies, "I understand. A battle of wits between 2 beings sharing a communal mind would only result in an infinite number of stalemates. Let's talk instead. You are still depressed about sending Abby away." And Swamp Thing replies, "It's more than that. I fear I face an impossible dilemma. This world is damned, no matter which course of action I choose." And the rock construct asks, "What do you mean?" And Swamp Thing answers, "My life has been a series of trials, which once completed have led to a number of rewards. When I passed the trials set by the Parliament of Trees, I was honored with control over the plants of this world. The Parliament of Stones granted me authority over the minerals, and the Parliament of Waves chose me as their water elemental." And the rock construct asks, "Don't these new abilities please you?" And as Swamp Thing stands up and a bird lands on his finger, he looks over at the construct and says, "No, they're making me dangerous. Already there are whispers in the trees about this power corrupting me, and I'm afraid to face the trial of the Parliament of Vapors. The ritual has already begun. A fantasy world is pouring into our own, through a chasm between our realms, and the destruction will be impossible to measure. Only I have the power to stop them. The air itself will then be under my control, and another nail will be hammered into the coffin of all mankind. I want to help these people, but I'm afraid it isn't possible." And then Swamp Thing slowly walks in between all the giant carved chess pieces, and he confesses to the rock construct, "I just don't know what to do." Then we turn the page and we cut to a woman driving a convertible in the night, and the narration over this part says, "The former Miss Rook en route to Manhattan." So this is the ex-wife of Jim Rook, who, if you remember in the last issue, was manipulated magically to leave her current husband and return to Jim Rook, who is in the city battling the warlocks as the Nightmaster. And as we zoom into the car, we see that she has a gun in one of her hands, and also she's got the radio on, and the radio is saying, "Our main news again for anyone just joining us. Manhattan has been declared a federal emergency zone after an outbreak of physical manifestations and supernatural attacks. All roads leading to the island have been closed off by presidential order. As yet, no supervillain groups have claimed responsibility for the problem, but federal investigators are following." But the news report is cut off by Janet, who reaches down in the car and clicks off the radio because she's approaching a police blockade that is blocking all the roads to Manhattan, just like the radio said. But instead of slowing down, Janet actually speeds up and says to herself, "All roads closed my sweet ass. Nobody's gonna keep me away from Jim Rook." And then she plows through the barricades as the police yell, "Jesus, watch out!" And another radios, "Checkpoint Gamma to Checkpoint Delta. We got a drive-through heading your way in a blue Mercedes convertible. One driver, possibly armed. I repeat, driver is possibly armed." Then we turn the page and we cut to a church. And inside that church, we see a priest lighting some candles. And the narration says, "Father Perez lights the same candles he burns every 24 hours for evening mass, knowing hardly a soul will show up. And why should they? Why would they come here on a night like this to pray to a God he doesn't even believe in anymore?" Then his thoughts are interrupted by some children who burst through the door and they're yelling, "Father, for God's sake, help us!" And as he turns, he sees three people, two children and an adult man. And the man is yelling, "It's a monster, Father! I swear to God, it chased us all the way here! It's outside right now!" And the priest looks at them and says, "Hold on, what's this about? Are you boys in some kind of trouble with the police? Because if you are, I want you to understand." But it's cut off by the father, who points to the door and says, "It's a monster, Father! Take a look and see for yourself!" And just as he says that, we see a hoof slam down onto the floor, and what this looks to be is some kind of demon beast with cloven hooves. It looks very much like Satan in all the old stories. And as the priest sees this, he says, "Jesus Christ!" Then we turn the page and we cut to in front of the Oblivion Inc. store, where we see Jim Rook as the Nightmaster chopping monsters in half with his bright flaming sword. And over this page, the narration says, "This is a tale that started on a continent you won't find on any illustrated map, or even in the most detailed and expensive atlas. It all began on a world that isn't real, filled with people who are nothing more than dreamy figments of someone's fevered imagination. A land where giants walk among the hills, where hobbits dwell, and magic swords bring power to those brave souls destined to hold them in their palms. This is the land of lies and make-believe, the shadow world on the other side of night. And this is the man who hopes to stop it." Then we cut to Boz, who is close by, and he sees an enemy who is about to attack Jim Rook from behind, and he yells out, "Nightmaster!" which causes the Nightmaster to turn and chop the head off of the demon behind him. And it seems that that was the last one that needed killing, so they take a break for a second, and as Jim Rook grabs his arm in pain, we see Boz yell out, "Hooray! You did it! You killed them all, just like the heroes are supposed to do! Now we can all go home to a victory banquet in Mira. But like I said, Jim Rook just looks like he's in pain, and he says, feels like I pulled my shoulder in the process, swinging this stupid sword around so much. I am definitely getting way too old for this adolescent sword and sorcery bullshit. And as Boz walks closer to him, he asks, does this mean we can all go home now? And Jim Rook looks down at him and says, sorry, Boz. Take a closer look at all the dead bodies lying around, and you'll notice there's not a drop of warlock blood to be found anywhere. Not a single drop. This was just a warm-up. The warlocks haven't even got here yet. And just as he says that, he hears a noise, so he whips around with his sword in his hands, ready to swing, but it is not a monster that is in front of him. It is actually his ex-wife. And this stops him dead in his tracks, and he says, Janet? And she replies, they tried to keep us apart, but I wouldn't give up, Jim. I just hit the gas pedal and drove through 4 police roadblocks, and nobody had the balls to get in my way. 2 butch patrolmen armed to the teeth tried to cuff me when I drove the Mercedes through a gas station window, but I took them both out with 2 shots to the head. Blam, blam, blam. Plus 1 to the balls for good luck. And as she says this, she has a very manic look on her face, almost like she's under some sort of spell, which of course we know she is. And of course Jim Rook is very surprised and confused at hearing all this, and he runs up to her and grabs her by the shoulders and says, Jesus Christ, Janet! And she looks at him in the eyes and says, we're together again, Jim. That's all that matters. And then this last panel on this page is actually from a TV screen, so we can assume that this is what Don Roberto is watching from South America. And in the TV screen, we see Jim Rook say, what have you done to your nice blonde hair? Which I guess he says because her hair used to be brown. Then we turn the page, and just like we suspected, Don Roberto is watching this on his TV. And as he watches the screen, we do see images of Jim Rook and his wife embracing and kissing each other. And as Don Roberto watches, the narration says, Don Roberto doesn't care much for romantic scenes, and he wishes the plot thread with the warlocks would resolve. Janet's hair was allergic to the dye she used, so she just let it go back to the natural brown. But it doesn't matter anyway. Blah, blah, blah. And after all, he and the others put every pleasant word in her mouth to give Jim Rook something worth fighting for. They misjudged the Swamp Thing's quest for power, and now the Nightmaster is their only hope against the warlocks. Who knows? He might even win. Stranger things have happened. Then we see Don Roberto lean closer to the TV, and I think he's doing this because he actually put the words in Janet's mouth, and he wants to see how Jim Rook responds to his words. Because we hear Janet say, I don't care about the life I've carved out for myself in Florida, or my marriage to that idiot accountant. I just want to be with you again, Jim, until death do us part. And then Jim kisses her very intensely, and the narration says, anyway, back to the warlocks. Then we cut back to the street where Jim Rook is talking to Janet, and it seems like this is exactly the moment after he kissed her, because he's staring into her eyes, holding her hands, and he says, shit, the sword's humming again. I didn't think they'd reach us so soon. And then Janet says, what does that mean? And as Jim runs off with his sword towards the Oblivion Ink door, he says, it means you better find a little hole somewhere and crawl inside till someone wipes the shit from the fan, baby. Someone who just happens to be me. And then Boz, who I guess was standing next to them the whole time, says, Nightmaster? And Jim Rook yells behind him, no arguments, Boz. Just blow. And of course, Boz obeys, so he grabs Janet and they both run to find shelter. Then we cut to Jim Rook, who looks very scared as he holds his sword in front of him, and he says to himself, Christ, how do I get myself into these totally ridiculous situations? And just as he hears that, he hears Janet say, wait a minute, who is he? And then we see Swamp Thing has appeared, and he's standing right behind Jim Rook. And I guess Jim feels this, and so he turns around quickly, and before he raises his sword to strike, Swamp Thing says, there's no need to be afraid. You're under my protection now. Wait here while I go inside. I stand a better chance of resisting the warlocks if I face them directly. So Swamp Thing goes inside of Oblivion Ink, leaving Jim Rook standing there, saying to himself, who the hell was that? Then we cut to inside as Swamp Thing is kind of skulking around, trying to be quiet, it seems. And as he does, he thinks to himself, it's empty. There's nothing here. Nothing except some old dusty paperbacks and the scent of loneliness upon the air. No sign of any warlocks. None visible, at least. So as he walks through Oblivion Ink, we see that it's definitely a bookstore, which I think is actually new information, because before, it didn't seem like they told us what Oblivion Ink was. But inside, there's just really tall bookshelves full of books, and there's even just tall stacks of books that aren't in shelves. And as Swamp Thing navigates through these tall stacks, trying to not knock them over, he narrates, "I hesitate for a moment, unsure what to do next, and then I hear a voice calling out to me from the shelves, followed by another, and another, as the fallen trees who gave their lives to create these volumes offer their assistance. Unsure which one to choose, I opt for the familiar face among the crowd." And we see Swamp Thing reach up to a bookshelf and take a book off of it, and we see as he brings it down, it is Lord of the Rings. So he sits down, and he cracks the book open, and as he does, he says to the book, "Show me what happened here, little brother. Why does this wave of madness affect the world outside?" Then we get a panel of a child reading a book at night in his bed with a flashlight, and Swamp Thing's narration says, "The dead trees answer. It shows me a boy, looking back at the words across its pages, leafing through, with sweaty fingers, eager to see what happens next. His parents are sleeping soundly in the next room, and he's reading this by flashlight, trying not to make a sound and promising each and every page will be his last. There are no warlocks here, no golems or trolls, except those within the pages of the books upon these shelves." Then we cut to an outside shot of the store Oblivion Ink, and his narration continues saying, "Oblivion Ink is nothing more than a physical manifestation of a desire to retreat back into a simpler age filled with books, which means so much to one particular individual." Then we see Swamp Thing in a rage hit one of the pillars of books next to him, which of course causes all the books to fall and rain down. But Swamp Thing doesn't even notice. He just quickly moves through the store towards the door, and his narration continues saying, "A name is beginning to form, written on the inside cover of every first edition and every cheap, tattered paperback. The root of the problem, his name." And as Swamp Thing bursts through the front door out to the street, he yells, "Who's Jim Rook?" And Jim looks up at him confused and he says, "What? I mean, that's me. I'm Jim Rook." And Swamp Thing says to him, "If you are Jim Rook, then this intersection of worlds has been your fault all along. Mira and its fairy tale people are nothing more than your retreat from the real world, brought to life by the scale of your misery. Search your feelings, Rook. What happened in your past, which now causes you such terrible pain? Why does your subconscious seek to destroy the world?" And then with a pained face, Jim looks back at his wife Janet, and Swamp Thing understands, so he reaches out and he puts his hand on Jim Rook's shoulder, and he says, "Gods are imprisoned in us all, Rook, encased in cages of flesh and bone. You can undo the terrible work you have done. The mind will find a way, if the heart is willing." And now that Jim Rook realizes that he's the cause of all of this pain and sadness and craziness that's been going on, and I'm assuming even the stuff that happened before when he was the Nightmaster and Mira when he was younger, all of that was his fault too, I guess. So he finally realizes this and he begins to cry and he says, "Christ, this is so embarrassing." Then we see the sun begin to rise on the city and it seems like everything's going back to normal. And over this panel, the narration says, "This is a story about a world that isn't real, full of people who are nothing more than dreamy figments of someone's fevered imagination. And so, one by one, they begin to disappear." Then we get some panels of what's going on as these manifestations disappear, and the narration says, "Miss Goldstein's bonsai tree gives up after a night of relentless song, leaving her alone in her apartment again with only the sound of passing traffic for company. Ignoring the clear warning, a man opens his wallet and carelessly exposes the goblin market tokens to the first light of morning, watching them dry up and turn into leaves." So this was from the beginning where that guy got money out of the ATM and it was goblin money. And it seems like all the rest of the panels are recounting what is happening in the scenes from before, because the next panel is with the AIDS patients, and then we also see panels of the priest who was fighting off the demon. And over these panels, the narration says, "The scent of morphine and hospital bleach returns as the sylphs fade away into nothing and the AIDS ward falls under shadow once again. Father Perez of St. Benedict's Parish Church finds he's got 4 new converts, including himself. And in this panel, we see Father Perez holding up a cross like he was fending off the demon with it. And then where the demon was, we just see a smoking blood spot on the floor. And then the priest looks down at his cross, and as he does, he says, "Mary, Mother of God, it actually worked." Then we cut back to Swamp Thing, who's standing next to a very old Jim Rook, and the narration says, "And Jim Rook is left on his own again." And as Rook stares at the sword in his hands, he says, "They're gone. Boz, Tark, Janet, all those people who meant so much to me, all gone forever." And Swamp Thing is a little confused, and he asks, "This woman you were with, she was part of your fantasy world too?" And Rook answers, "Are you kidding? She was my wife. Breaking up with Janet was probably the main reason I lost my grip on the real world, man. Realizing she didn't want me anymore is what gave me the strength to let go." Then we see Swamp Thing look up like he's concentrating, and we see a picture form in his mind of Janet sleeping next to her husband, and Swamp Thing says to Rook, "I can sense her presence in Florida, lying asleep between the four corners of an old bed beside her husband. They will remember nothing when they wake. Your former wife was just a pawn in an awesome game, controlled like you and I to serve a higher purpose. You should be glad not to understand. My choosing to help you was no blessing. I fear the game has just become deadlier still." And Jim Rook just stares at the Oblivion Inc. storefront, and he says to Swamp Thing, "Yeah, well, I'm just glad you showed up and saved my ass before things got completely out of hand. But one thing I can't figure out is why this happened to me. I mean, I'm nobody special. How come I was able to build this whole shop with my subconscious mind and fill it with all these old dumb books I lost when I was a kid? Who's behind this shit, man? What's going on down here?" So while Jim Rook was talking and staring at Oblivion Inc., he couldn't see Swamp Thing. So as he was talking, we see this mist begin to gather around Swamp Thing, and it's almost like the mist begins to envelop him and then lift him up, because Swamp Thing floats away with the mist following him. And when Jim Rook turns around to ask his question, Swamp Thing is nowhere to be found. Then we turn the page and we get a full page splash of Swamp Thing floating amongst the clouds, and each of the clouds has a Swamp Thing face in them. And their red eyes are staring at him, and Swamp Thing looks back at them and says, "Where am I? How can you do this to me?" And a voice from the cloud answers, "The spoken word has no meaning in this place. It is the tool of those who live below. You will use the language of the mind if you wish to address the Parliament." And upon hearing this, Swamp Thing realizes what it is, and he says out loud, "The Parliament of Vapors." And the Parliament replies, "Use your mind. You are not among men now." So correcting himself, Swamp Thing thinks, "Oh my God." And at that, the Parliament begins to speak, saying, "We are the Flatless ones who devised the ritual you have endured, Holland Mind. Our trials were not physical like those laid down by the others, but based on intellect. You were given a dilemma, and you made the correct choice. There is no turning back now. The Nightmaster was chosen as the catalyst for your elevation because the sword symbolizes not only air, but also intelligence and reason. These qualities were needed to halt the migration from Rook's personal dream world, and the sword will make a perfect gift for the Star Child. You have done adequately and should be rewarded." And Swamp Thing begins to plead with them, thinking, "Please, I mean no offense, but spare me the abilities of an air elemental. The terrible power already within me is stripping away what's left of my humanity, and I fear for the world below." And the Parliament replies, "The hurricanes now belong to you. Every breath upon this world is exhaled in your honor. Reaching this level has brought together the earth, the water, and the air of this planet. A reward is necessary. Now, When we send you back to your home in the swamps, your physical body will be as alien as the new perceptions prepared for you. Cherish these human doubts and insecurities now, because they will be your last. Everything you have feared is about to come true. Then we turn the page and we cut back to the bar in South America, where L. Senior Blake is sitting at the table, and he is joined by the Traveler, who is holding Jim Rook's sword. And the Traveler says to Blake, "How much did Jim Rook want for the sword?" And Blake replies, "Not a lot. Just enough to buy a few things to help furnish our little lady's new apartment. If he ever needs the sword again, I'm sure he'll find one." Then we see Blake look over to the bar, and we see Jim Rook is talking to a woman there. And as Blake watches them talk, he says, "The guy really is as much of a gentleman as he looks. Makes you sick." Then we see the Traveler put the sword on the table, and next to it there are a couple more objects. There was the book called River Run, which was the catalyst for the Parliament of Waves trial, and also the red ruby that was in Sargon's turban from the Parliament of Stones trial. And as he sets the sword down, the Traveler says to Blake, "The sword of the Nightmaster, Sargon's ruby of life, and River Run, the collected works of a writer whose experiences span the countless dimensions. Only one more gift to be collected for the Star Child, and our mission here will be over, Blake." And Blake, who's still staring at Jim Rook talking to the woman at the bar, specifically at the way the woman is reacting to Jim Rook, says, "Man, look at her, sitting there drinking vodka and orange like it's going out of fashion. Talking to Jim Rook about wallpaper in her kitchen. If only she knew, huh?" And then he turns back to the Traveler, who says, "The first of the new breed won't be born for a while yet, Blake. Let her build her nest here." And Blake replies, "The Parliament of Vapors should be finished with the swamp monster by now too, Traveler. You curious what he's going to look like?" And the Traveler replies, "His look will reflect his tasks ahead, Blake. Rest assured, it will be terrifying." Then we turn to the last page, which is a full-page splash, and we see what looks like a vaporous image of Swamp Thing, but he's kind of in the shadows behind a bunch of trees in the swamp. And he's looking at us kind of angrily, but we can only see his red eyes showing, and they're staring right at us. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.